The Voices of Texas is a liberal arts council podcast at the University of Texas founded to address social issues.
Hi, and welcome to the Voices of Texas podcast. I'm your host, Joseph Cudlin. I'm here with Kara H. and Muzara, and I'd also like to introduce our guest speaker, who is the Associate Dean for Student Affairs in the College of Liberal Arts. Thank you for being with us today, Dean Carter.
Thank you. It's a pleasure. Thanks for inviting me.
Today, we're going to be talking about the infamous unofficial UT fight song, The Eyes of Texas. This song was made over 100 years ago, but in recent years, many people have become more aware of its problematic history, thanks to the work of the Orange Jackets, UT athletes, and the Longhorn Band, especially and specifically the Longhorn Blacks, who have all protested the song at football games. But for those who don't know, what's the history behind The Eyes of Texas?
Robert E. Lee had a saying, "The eyes of the South are upon you," which he used at every opportunity in his speeches. Prather, who worked at Washington and Lee College alongside Lee, liked that phrase so much he put his own spin on it, and he would end every single speech with the phrase, "The eyes of Texas are upon you." When Prather became president of UT in 1899, his saying quickly became famous on campus. Now, every year there was an annual campus minstrel show. A minstrel show is when white people dress up in blackface and do a variety of acts like skits, dancing, singing, etc. This was organized by Texas Cowboys Spirit Group, and its director was Lewis Johnson. Since a minstrel show was coming up, Johnson tasked his roommate, John Sinclair, to write the song for the show.
So the night before the show, Sinclair recalled President Prather's famous saying, feverishly wrote lyrics to a song on a scrap of laundry paper and ran to meet up with Johnson. The song on that scrap of paper was set to this tune of "I've Been Working on the Railroad." We now call this song "The Eyes of Texas." Johnson loved it and was eager to play it at the annual campus minstrel show the following night, where he knew Prather would be in attendance. They played it for the minstrel show and received thunderous applause from everyone, including Prather himself. But that fall during UT's game against A&M and UT was down, so they took a timeout. To rally the football team, a student started singing the words, and soon hundreds followed, and thus a tradition was born. From this point on, The Eyes of Texas would always be sung at football games.
Now, before we hop into the discussion, I think it's very important to point out that we are not the first people to bring this up and acknowledge the song's racist history. A decade ago, a group of UT basketball players refused to sing the song after learning its history. In 2018, the Orange Jackets refused to sing it at football games. And this summer, in the aftermath of the death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and Ahmaud Arbery, UT Black athletes released a letter with a list of demands directed towards administration to address UT's racist history pertaining to statues, building names, and a song to replace The Eyes of Texas, one that didn't have racist undertones. And this fall, the Longhorn Blacks have protested playing it at football games. The Longhorn Blacks are a part of the Longhorn Band. And so my first question is, does The Eyes of Texas need to be removed as the official song for UT or unofficial fight song for UT?
I'd love to hear what you guys think first. We have a freshman, brand new Longhorn. What other years are you guys, Kara and Mosrat?
I'm a junior.
I'm also a junior.
I am a transfer though, so this is like only my second semester at UT.
Yeah. So what are your thoughts about it? And then I'll share mine.
I personally think that it's something that needs to be changed because it's one of those things where I don't know how to like articulate myself very well. Sorry. I just think it's one of those things that if the school wants to say that they're doing all they can for Black students, it's something that's just easy to fix so that, Black students can feel more accepted. And because it's something that a lot of people know about and a lot of people are talking about. And it just seems a little weird that it keeps being like pushed aside as kind of like, no, but it's part of tradition, so we shouldn't change it. I don't know, that just doesn't sit right with me personally.
Yeah, I agree. I would say UT has this sort of moral upstanding that they like to claim they have, of being inclusive and of promoting diversity. And I think we have come a long way, but there's still so much more to go. And keeping the Eyes of Texas as our, I guess, official song is just a testament to this sort of like, I guess, theatric activism, where we say that we like to promote these values that are extremely important. But when there's something that's so hurtful and detrimental, like the Eyes of Texas, it's completely dismissed. So I think the university needs to take these considerations more seriously, and they need to listen to the students who are telling them that this is hurtful. And I think just their answer that this is tradition, this has caused a lot of really happy memories for a lot of families and students, completely undershoots the amount of distress and I think just the inappropriate nature that the song has, considering where we are in our history.
Joseph.
Okay. Personally, I cannot speak because I'm not African American. My personal opinion is that despite it being a tradition, not all tradition is good. You can't hold on to tradition and automatically that gives it the pass. America has, arguably slavery is a tradition in America. It existed for nearly 250 years. But in 1865, 13th Amendment, slavery is abolished. We recognize that is an awful tradition to have and have done our best to distance ourselves from it. And so just because it's tradition, it doesn't give itself that pass. I think at the end of the day, it should be removed or find something to take its place.
I think the tradition argument is really weak. And, culture changes, culture evolves. And, there are traditions that nurture us and make us feel like we belong. And those same traditions can make someone else feel alienated and threatened. We have these courses that encourage difficult dialogues. And I think we need to have a serious and substantial dialogue about, what is this attachment to this song? What are the emotions that are circling around just the idea of changing it? And I know that the administration is in a really tough position because they're hearing from alumni and donors and people who have really deep attachments to the song, and even some of the Black athletes like Earl Campbell, have said this song means a lot to me. But I think, it's our imperative to really think about change. And when I was thinking about preparing for, or just like, what is my position on this? Getting ready, when we were getting ready to record, I just thought, we have a great fine arts school. We have a great music program. Like, why not have a contest that to kind of even like repurpose a fragment of it, or to come up with a new song? Like, we have 40 acres on campus, so why not take like 40 seconds of the old Eyes of Texas and challenge musicians and composers in our wonderful School of Fine Arts to come up with a new song, to embrace change. And I really was impressed by the way that you framed this conversation. And for some people will maintain their sentimental attachment to the Eyes of Texas, but for your generation, I think it's going to be increasingly difficult to, once you become conscious of something, once you become aware of the depth of a history, you can't become unaware of that. And so I think it's your generation. That's why I wanted to hear you all first, that really has the complex relationship to this song and to questions about tradition and what it means to be a Longhorn and how we embrace change and how we grow together. And when I first heard the Eyes of Texas, they always ended the kind of new faculty orientation with singing it. And as someone who didn't know the history of the song at all, I just thought the song was downright creepy. It's just like the Eyes of Texas, you cannot get away. It's like, what is this? What is this song they're encouraging us to sing? And then when you learn the history of it and the minstrel traditions and its roots in slavery, and it's just, you can't dismiss that from your mind. And I've felt really proud of the athletes and the students on campus who have been encouraging us to like learn and grow together. Like, we could take down the Confederate statues, we have those empty pedestals that should also be repurposed, and have new histories and new ideas placed on them. It's like this rootedness in the past is, and to, you know, the argument about, well, it's always been our tradition, I think it's a static argument, and we don't grow together, and we don't, you know, the idea that the Eyes of Texas is this precious thing and the university's meaning is going to change for everyone if you change the song is, you know, I think it's a really limited way of thinking about it.
Now there's a second question I want to raise. This is another, you know, counter argument, or rather, you know, argument for keeping it. That let's say we remove the song. Is this erasing history? If we remove the song, is that a version of erasing history?
You know, it depends on what you think history is and how you define history. I mean, there's the history we live, there's the history of our emotions, there's history in monuments, there's history in archives, there's, you know, there's, I don't think history gets erased. You know, and I think the song should be repurposed. You know, as someone who studies modernist culture, it's like, well, yeah, take a fragment and make something new of it. I mean, the song itself is a relic of a culture that we no longer approve of, mostly, I would hope, as a you know, as a national culture. And it's like, that history doesn't disappear. I mean, it still hurts people, and it still has a kind of power, but we don't have to let that remain a static thing. Like, we can actively think about it. And I don't think getting rid of a song erases history.
I agree.
Kara, would you? Yeah.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, I agree. I think, I think we forget a lot that there's more than one version of history, and the history that we like to talk about more often is the history of, you know, the people with all the privilege. And it's, I don't know, I just don't think that changing a song such as this one, I mean, it's replacing it with something that represents more of what we stand for as a university would be, I think, a wiser thing, because we're starting new history that actually represents us, instead of, you know, like clinging to something just because, you know, alumni or donors have a sentimental connection to it. Like, just because that's true doesn't mean that it's something that we need to uphold, or like uphold the history that comes with it.
Yeah.
Mozart, would you like to say anything? Or?
No, I completely agree. I think saying that this is erasing history is just sort of a cheap cop-out, and just like a last-ditch attempt at trying to preserve something that's so hurtful. I think what it is it warrants difficult discussions like we're having right now, and being more open about what the true history of this song is. And instead of just taking it at face value and just singing it blindly without knowing what it means, the university has a responsibility to tell the students about its history, so that we're all more educated and more socially aware of not only the university we attend, but the community that we live in. You know, UT and even the city of Austin has a long history, one that has to do with race. And I think that this is something that is so important to talk about. So instead of just saying this is erasing history, I think we need to look at it more so that this is progressing and moving forward the way that we're supposed to be going, and having the difficult discussions and conversations like we are right now, to talk about history in a more true light, rather than in this sort of biased way that we've been having for so long.
Yeah, when I was this afternoon, I reread this essay by James Baldwin that it's called A Talk to Teachers, and it was a speech that he gave in 1963, and he was just talking to teachers about the kind of moral imperatives of education. And there's two quotes that I thought were perfect for this discussion. And one, he says, "The paradox of education is precisely this, that as one begins to become conscious one becomes to examine the society in which he is being educated. And then he says at the end of the essay, it is your responsibility to change society if you think of yourself as an educated person. And he argues that students have the right and the necessity to examine everything. And I think that's bound to make people feel uncomfortable and to feel emotional about the things that are changing. I just think when we as human beings and as humanists and liberal arts people become afraid of thinking about change or embracing change, that we just stop growing. And like life is change and culture is not static and traditions evolve. And I think that so much of what people think about history or tradition is really complicated under its surfaces and is always caught up with like myth and fantasy and desire. And traditions can be really powerful. They can help forge community and give people a sense of belonging and attachment, and mutuality, but they can also, be really painful and pernicious. And like this history is now part of our present moment of helping us to think about, the university's values and what the 21st century University of Texas community is and longs for and hopes is part of our shared culture. And I think we can be brave. I think we can be brave enough to change a song or to repurpose it, or to think beyond that kind of unchanging attachment.
Yeah, I think that's what a lot of people struggle with, because some of the arguments, of course, we already addressed the tradition argument. We've addressed that how everyone associates it with UT. It's sort of our unofficial brand. When people sing it, they feel like something bigger than themselves, but also this is tied to, sadly, the racist traditions of UT. It's tied to an uncomfortable history that is not easy to talk about by any means, but one that we simply have to talk about and have to address. Otherwise, one might consider that we're erasing history by looking at it through rose-colored glasses and in a way kind of just ignoring that it happened, where we have to own up and be like, yes, it happened. And here's what we can do to be better. And so my next question is, what is admin's take on this issue? Because recently I saw, I believe the Daily Texan have a interview with Dr. Hartzell, of which I believe I saw like a 2-minute snippet where he kind of danced around and said certain things as if, how do I phrase this? He used words like people have said the eyes of Texas are, racially adjacent, or have, I believe he said undertones and overtones of racism, but without actually or explicitly saying it is racist. And so do you think he should come out and openly address it? Do you believe that he is stating, rather, where do you think those words are coming from? Do you believe they're, coming from a university's official message, or rather higher above? Because at the end of the day, the president of UT still has to report to the UT Board of Regents, which reports to the governor. And so there is a somewhat of a power structure at play. So do you believe that that's his own agenda, or rather someone top down? And what can we do to address this?
Yeah, I think that President Hartzell is in a thankless position, and I certainly would never want to be a university president. I think he's being, I remember reading part of that. I think he's being cautious and careful and trying not to offend anyone. And I just think with questions of race and racism and systemic and institutionalized racism, we're gonna hurt people's feelings, and we're gonna break eggs, and people are gonna be angry about the difficult parts of those dialogues, and and when we're just so bad at talking about race and racism in this country in a public way, even in a university setting. It can be really, when race comes up in the classroom, it can be so volatile. And I just give my major props to all of our wonderful ethnic studies faculty and the ads faculty and people who deal with race in the classroom all the time, because it's a tough job. So I think that President Hartzell is being careful. I don't know if that's the best take. It's not necessarily the one that I would take. I think we're a university and we have scholars of history and scholars of race, and it's like, let's have a forum. Let's have involve all of the aspects of the campus, create a new song, make it part of a cultural conversation that is not about avoidance and trying to make everybody feel comfortable. Education is really not supposed to be a comfortable process all the time. And but it is much easier for me to say, as the person who's not the university president, it's like, let's get into this as thinking people and let's do it together. Let's do it as the hard work of thinking about what the song means and the kinds of legacies that exist in this in this campus, in its landscape, in its, in its institutional structures. And, we have the legacies of systemic racism all around us at UT. I mean, you look at the structure powers and the hierarchies, you look at the composition of the faculty, you look at the underrepresentation of students, Black and brown students on campus, and those things are changing, and there's been tremendous effort and goodwill and positive change, but it doesn't stop with like, okay, we let you in the door now, and you're here. The notion of what is ours as a culture, as a university campus, is an ongoing conversation. And and I think the idea that this song is ours and it represents us needs to be questioned, and is being questioned, and should be tackled as something that is a really serious part of our culture and feelings of community and belonging. And it's representative. People's feelings about this song are representative of so many of the problems that we have in our country today. You agree with me, you're okay, you don't, you want to change something that I love, you're the bad person, and I don't want to hear about race. Why do you have to make everything about race? I mean, we have a lot of work to do, and if we can't use our experts and our artists and our cultural critics and our wonderful minds as a community of thinkers together to approach this song, it's a song that, how are we going to do the other hard work that we have to do as citizens and members of a community?
Yeah, and I believe that in the larger scheme of America, unfortunately, people say, why? Yeah, like you said, why do we make everything about race? But if you look at America's history, everything was about race. Race was used as a toxic category. The moment slaves arrived in America, 1619, up until 1965, and even past that, because even though, yes, racism is not as prevalent as it was in the 60s towards the end of Jim Crow, it nonetheless still exists in small pockets of America and in places we don't even realize. For example, in cases like redlining, which is still a problem in some cities, where banks will just cross off parts of the city to not loan out money. But then when you look at the plots of land that they're crossing out, saying we're not going to loan money, those are predominantly communities of color, and so that negatively affects African Americans, Hispanic Americans, Native Americans, Asian Americans. And so unfortunately in America, everything is about race, and we have to sit down and talk about it.
Yeah, and I think we're going to remain in a really terrible place as a country until we learn how to do that, and do it through all the discomforts that are involved, and you know, and really start to think about, yeah, why am I so attached to this tradition? What does it mean that I can't even, you know, I'm not even willing to understand that this is the legacy of this song and all of it represents is hurtful to other people. Like, what does it mean about you if you're not willing to acknowledge somebody else's discomfort and pain?
Now, so an argument of Jay Hartzell I've seen, Dr. Hartzell, President Hartzell, is that I believe it's to reclaim the history. So this begs the question: is it even possible to reclaim the history when it is a tenet? The Eyes of Texas is a tenet of UT's racist history. How do we go about reclaiming it? Is there a way to frame it and still keep the song with a good conscience?
I don't know what President Hartzell meant by reclaiming it, because, you know, I mean, I love, as a person who's really interested in culture, the idea of repurposing it, or, you know, reducing it to a fragment, or, you know, having it part of of the Eyes of Texas as a refrain in a new song that, you know, I don't believe that you can. I don't know what he meant by that. I don't know what he meant by reclaim it. Just like, okay, what? So
That's fair, yeah.
I think there's a way to preserve an aspect of history, but view it in a different light. So of course, maybe when something exists in a certain time period, years later, we may understand it in a different way, but we're still learning about it. And I think that's how history works. Like we talked about, history and culture changes. The way we perceive things changes, like, and it should. As we grow older, we have more access to means, and we're gaining different perspectives every day now, more than, you know, people before us have been able to. So I think, you know, one of the things we've discussed before this discussion was a way for the university to have courses, or have like those mandatory pre-admission courses where we talk about, here's the history of UT, the Eyes of Texas, and students are enlightened and learning about the different, I guess you could say, traditions UT has, but now we're understanding it for what it is. So it's not so much singing the Eyes of Texas with pride and saying that this is something great and it's tradition, and everyone should just, you know, sing Kumbaya and just hold hands and just take it for face value. Instead, we can talk about it and say that this was, you know, extremely hurtful. This was used in minstrel shows. This is the history behind it. But we've come a long way from that. We've progressed and we've changed, and we hope that you guys will accompany us on this ever-ending journey of change.
I like the ever-ending journey of change.
Yeah.
You know, I don't know if Dr. Ted Gordon's racial history tour on campus is part of orientation. I know we're not in the face-to-face world, but I think that there's a digital kind of version of it available. I just, you know, I think that would be critical to just have as ritualized into campus orientation. I know you all were thinking about kind of mandatory kind of classes, or you know, what was it? You were comparing the kind of what's the other mandatory part of orientation that you were comparing it to?
Those online sort of like modules. That gives like the necessary, like it tells you facts and information so that you're better prepared when you come to campus. I think it was sexual assault, drug abuse, and I think like consuming alcohol, things of that nature.
Now, given, you know, in 2020, a tumultuous year, just in this past year, you know, numerous professional sports teams have how they've handled, you know, racist or offensive mascots or offensive team names. Now, Washington's football team, they changed it from, I will actually not say the name of it because it is a racial slur of Native Americans, but they changed it to the Washington football team. The Cleveland Indians, MLB, Major League Baseball, they changed their racist mascot as it was a racist caricature of Native Americans. And very recently, I remember watching the NFL, a football game on Thanksgiving Day. And I think it was very important because they brought up this issue and talking about renaming the Washington football team. And they brought in this famous Native American football player. I wish I remembered his name, but his name just isn't coming to mind. But they sat down with him and talked about, how important it is, to change the name, to learn the history, and to simply be better. There's no reason to hold on to a name if it offends people. You can easily pick something like you did Washington football team. It's as simple as that. Now, we've kind of touched on this before, but just because the Eyes of Texas are tradition, is tradition worth keeping even when it's problematic?
I would say no, it's not. That, tradition is something we should make inquiries about. Tradition is something we should reflect upon. Traditions are sometimes shared and sometimes harmful simultaneously. I think we're complex enough as human beings to really examine those paradoxes. And when, if you think about people who get fanatically attached, that may be too strong a word, but fanatically attached to a tradition, the Confederate flag is, an example. It's just like, well, what are you really trying to say? And I remember when I first came to campus, and I'm from Massachusetts and went to grad school in Wisconsin, but when I first came to Texas and on campus, seeing people, where I wanted to just ask, like, what do you, this was a lost cause and a war of sedition and, treason. And what does this mean to you? Of course, I never wanted to take that risk of, why are you wearing that shirt? And what does it mean to you? And what are you trying to say? And why for you? Why is your identity, connected to this? But I just think that, we have lots of brilliant people on campus who think about tradition in very sophisticated ways and can be wonderful facilitators of a kind of shared conversation around these things. And I just think we need to use the resources, our brilliant human resources on campus, which is you students, and the faculty in American studies and history and in African American and African diaspora studies, in the indigenous studies program. We have such a rich community of thinkers. Why not turn this into an opportunity instead of make it a crisis or the basis of a conflict?
I agree. I think I don't see the value in carrying on a tradition if we're so intent on kind of erasing or ignoring the history of the tradition. Isn't the point that we like where it came from and we're carrying it on, so that it has a legacy that we're proud of? I just think that I feel like I hear a lot of people say that we have reclaimed the song, or just by singing it in a not racist context, that it's no longer racist, without putting in any work to educate people on where it came from. People seem to think that we can just say something is no longer problematic, and it is, without putting in the work to actually try to make a difference. And I think that's something that's really important for us to do, if even at the very least, if the song remains some sort of statement before we sing it, or something that's just saying this is what it's about, just so you are not singing it unaware of where this came from. At the very least, we should be educated on the traditions that we're carrying on and perpetuating. I think that's the bare minimum of what's important to do when we have problematic stuff in our past as a university.
Yeah, when I read the story in I don't know if it was in the Daily Texan or the Austin American Statesman, about some of the members of the band just refusing to play it, I just had this image of a sheet of music, with holes being eaten into parts of the music sheet. And I just thought it was, the song is changing already when people certain parts of the band are sitting out and refusing to play it. And I just think it's a powerful image of like the possibilities of, not reclaiming it, but transforming, using this moment to kind of transform our ideas about what a school song should be. And that doesn't mean throwing the whole thing in the trash, but or trying to pretend that its complex legacies don't exist just because we don't want to think about it. But I've been really moved and inspired, really. I mean, I think the athletes and the musicians and the students who have been for decades trying to create a conversation about the song and its place of reverence on campus have been really inspirational and courageous. And I just have tremendous appreciation for, particularly the athletes. I mean, I read some of the stuff that was, in the mediascape when the athletes were protesting, and man, they took a lot of racist crap. A lot of it was racist. It was like, shut up and play, and like, you're lucky that we let you in, and and it just was kind of endemic of what do you mean we let you in, or you're there to play football and shut up? And it's like, well, this is not a plantation. Yeah, I just think the kinds of emotional reactions that people have when they don't want to think about something in a complex way, they're uncomfortable by the conversation. We can't let that be the overriding sentiment.
I think it really is very important that UT Black athletes have really stepped up, and also members of the Longhorn Blacks, part of Longhorn Band, really stepping up and saying, "Hey, we're not going to play this," or "Hey, we need to recognize the history." Or like this past summer when the football players and UT Black athletes called for demand and got the RLM changed to the PMA. I mean, stuff like that. You may think it's a small victory, but I can imagine it really means a lot. It really shows in what direction UT can move in if pushed.
Yeah, and it's the pushing is sometimes just a necessary part of the process of change, and it doesn't make anyone happy. It doesn't make administrators' jobs any easier. Alumni often think like, who's radicalizing these students? Like, why are they? It's like, but this is what thinking is, and thinking means that we can look at traditions and institutions and imagine them in different ways, and make them work for the present and the future. I just think, I think we need to be more oriented toward the present and the future, and instead of so offended about changing something that people have sentimental attachments to. I mean, you want to sing the Eyes of Texas at the end of the game, or and that's really deeply important to you. I would just like to know how you can think about that, how we can encourage people to think about that in different ways.
And so now I'd like to, how does this differ from Painter Hall? Because in our previous episode, we discussed Painter Hall, and that is also a building that is named after former president of UT, T.S. Painter, whose legacy was sitting before the Supreme Court and arguing against the admission of Heman Sweat, an African-American, into the UT Law School for the sole purpose of him being African-American.
Yeah, I think it's an issue like this is definitely, it has to be approached differently because, the Eyes of Texas, according to a lot of people, has taken on a life beyond its racist origins, unlike Painter Hall, which is essentially like an emblem to that kind of like racist action. But now, or for a while, a lot of people that sang the Eyes of Texas didn't know about any of this stuff from its past. So does that change the way that we have to talk about it?
Yeah, I think, changing, like taking down, I think it's a really excellent question, Joseph, and I'm not sure that I have the answer to it, but, I know there were changing the names of buildings and taking down statues. People still had, mixed feelings or angry feelings or relieved feelings and appreciative feelings about those. I mean, there were a range of responses to both the taking down of the Confederate statues and then I just think with something like a school song, or I think the songs in the sports teams, they're these things that people associate with their pleasure and their sense of belonging. Like we don't have the same kind of, in general, I think that we don't have the same kinds of circulation of emotions around buildings. Yeah, but in general, I just think that even those conversations about changing the names of buildings are hard for people and are the source of conflict and argument. But there's something about the kind of the cultures that we live with that are much more difficult for people to examine and reflect upon.
So now, in a closing, what is the cumulative, no rose-colored glasses, honest legacy of the Eyes of Texas?
It's a song with its roots in minstrelsy, which was a really grotesque, racist cultural tradition that, played up the inhuman, bestial representations of Black people. Minstrelsy was never an innocent form of entertainment. We've culturally inherited lots of minstrel songs that have become part of American folk culture, but those are the racist parts of those roots matter, and understanding those racist roots and recognizing them is the really important part of our thinking about what the United States is and should be and should become. And the becoming part is really, I think, the hard part for people, and this is where tradition gets people so caught up in these kind of sticky webs of emotion. Where the United States is changing. The United States is browning. The United States is more
diverse.
Yeah, diverse and complex in ways that I think frighten the heck out of a lot of people. And so when you want to change a song or change a tradition, it's like reflective of those larger forces of change, which are to be celebrated, that we're becoming more diverse and that culture is whatever American or US culture is a part of a wide range of culture. It's not one culture. We're not a monoculture. I just think that we have a lot of people who, like the Make America Great Again slogan, like, well, what does that exactly mean? And I think that we are living in a moment of great fear about cultural change and about the demographic shifts in this country. And I think that for some, I'm an older person myself, so I can say some older people are kind of, and yeah, I don't think this is just generational, but I just think that there's been so much visible change in the textures and the cultures and the demographics of this country that people feel at sea. And so sometimes their attachments to things like a song or their team's name, those things feel really threatening when people want to change them or talk about what's underneath the surface of traditions to which they've been attached. And I think that I greatly admire your willingness to get into the messy work of thinking about culture and change and tradition and institutional and systemic racism, and the traces of those racist traditions that are in things like songs.
Throughout this whole conversation, and I think that in of itself is very telling of not only the legacy of the Eyes of Texas, but unfortunately the legacy of the university. We have to come to a point where we are realistic, and I think it's naive for people to defend singing the Eyes of Texas by putting it under the guise of tradition. When we understand something is hurtful and no longer socially acceptable, then we have the responsibility to do something about it to counteract that. If we want to be inclusive, and if we want to keep up with the times, if you will, like we said, the face of America is changing. And I think that's a very exciting thing. And the university is lacking behind in keeping up with these changes. The student body is changing, the way that we think is changing. And so I think the administration has a duty to make sure that they're keeping up and changing with us instead of trying to resist these changes, because change is good. And I think, it's going to happen. It's inevitable, whether people like it or not. So it's definitely something that we all need to come together and have a discussion about, like we're doing right now.
I think a good summary of the legacy of the Eyes of Texas is one that started originally from just a small quote taken as a quixotic parody of a saying of Robert E. Lee, adopted by a former UT president, William Prather, and taken down to UT, where someone eventually made a song out of it to play it at the annual campus minstrel show, which was a show solely to make fun of and the best way to put it is it truly displayed offensive caricatures of African Americans. That is the sole purpose of a minstrel show. And so the fact that this song originated there is deeply troubling and deeply telling of its roots. And so the legacy, despite how over time we may not sing it to be racist, nonetheless, and the fact that it is ingrained in part of UT, and I understand a lot of people feel very strongly about it, we cannot deny its racist roots. It originated from a quote taken from Robert E. Lee, played at a minstrel show. It is undeniably racist. There's simply no other way to put it. And so this brings me to my next question. How do we deal or cope with the song now, knowing it has a problematic history? Should we sing along with it? Is it problematic, if we still sing it? Can we, find us another song? Should we just boycott the song?
Yeah, I think that is going to be definitely a decision that people make on a case-by-case basis. And I've thought in the past about my own relationship to the song and just like finding it really weird and creepy initially, and then being at Lady Longhorns games or volleyball games and getting caught up in that. Particularly after a victory. No one wants to sing the Eyes of Texas when we lose, I think. But having been swept up in that moment of the kind of sports collective joy, but I could never sing the song again. And I would love us to have a new song and just embrace the challenge of coming up with a new song. And I don't think banning the song is going to succeed in any way. I think people are going to, those band members are going to sit it out, and some athletes will sit it out. And I think those are powerful ways to keep the conversation going. I think outright banning the song would potentially be counterproductive and make reactionary people even fetishize it even more. But I would love us to approach it as a kind of cultural, historical, and moral and ethical question, and as a community, and really embrace the present and not be so unnaturally attached to legacy and heritage and tradition. I mean, legacy, heritage, and tradition are sometimes very problematical ways in which we refuse to think and change.
That's true. Throughout American history, we've fallen into that trap several times. I've already talked about slavery, but there was a tradition of women not being able to vote in America. That changed in 1920 with a constitutional amendment. There was a tradition in America of Jim Crow laws that ended. It started in the South in the aftermath of the Civil War, and that ended in the mid 1960s, 1964, 1965. There was a Chinese Exclusion Act passed in the middle of in 1880s, and it stayed on. It stayed as law on the books until the middle of World War II when we finally repealed it. It stayed as a law for 60 years and banned people of Chinese descent from entering the country for the sole reason of being Chinese. And so I think it's very important that we address our past, and even if it is tradition, we remove ourselves from it.
Going forward, I definitely don't feel comfortable singing the song, especially after so many Black students have expressed how it makes them uncomfortable. I find it very troubling that there are people that can hear those kind of complaints and still brush them aside. But I know people have their own ideas about how we should treat this issue. So I think the most important thing going forward is just going to be to have open communication about this issue and not let it get suppressed by people that don't feel comfortable talking about difficult subjects like racism and legacy and stuff like that. I think if we come across somebody who doesn't know about the history of the song and wants to sing it, we should, try to educate them, tell them what it's about, because if they don't know, then they can't, critically think about what to do about it. And I think the more people that we get thinking about it and thinking about what this means for us and the legacy of the university, the better for us going forward. So I think that's probably the most important thing.
I really like what you said, just to keep the conversation alive, because the more we talk about it, it will encourage others to think critically about its value, to really reflect on it, not look through it through rose-colored glasses, and to really sit down and address the ugliness of, the conversation we're having. And so as long as you keep talking about it, it'll keep the conversation alive so we can keep thinking about it and actually get to the bottom of this. And on our Instagram page, UTLAC, you can sign these petitions to properly address the eyes of Texas. Now, we understand that this is a tough discussion to have, and it's a much more cumbersome argument because of the good and the bad of the song. It's a song that's brought people together and made them feel a part of something bigger than themselves. But at the same time, that song has reminded us of the horrific racial specters of our past, America's past, and UT's past, not to mention how this negatively affects African-American and Black students on campus. I can't imagine what they feel when they hear this song. And so we want to thank you for listening, keeping an open mind, and educating yourself on these issues. And so I'd like to leave you with a closing quote. The ultimate measure of a person is not where one stands in moments of comfort and convenience, but where one stands in times of challenge and controversy. Martin Luther King Jr. All right.
I love that. It works well with the James Baldwin quote. It's here's our wise people speaking to us from the past about how we think about the past and change in really hard, difficult, and substantial ways.
All right. That seems like a good place to leave it. Thank you, Kara. Thank you, Muzrat. And a big thanks to Dean Carter for coming on to our podcast. My name is Joseph Cudler, and this was the second episode of the Voices of Texas podcast.